Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Hi and welcome. I'm Paul Lancaster of University Relations at Virginia Tech, and our guest today is Doris Zallen, who is Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Virginia Tech and founder of the Choices and Challenges series here of science and technology issues of great public interest. But we're here today to talk about something a little more specific, a new book she has written called To Test or Not to Test, a consumer guide to all the genetic testing issues that are out there. And it's done by Rutgers University Press. Doris, let me kind of start out with the broad, what's the book about? What are you trying to do here?
Well, the book is about genetic testing in general, but especially the newest forms of genetic testing that can tell us if we're more susceptible to certain kinds of illnesses. And these are common illnesses like breast cancer or colon cancer, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth. There are lots of genetic tests coming along and already available for consumers, and the book is a guide so that consumers can decide for themselves whether this test is right for them or whether any particular genetic test is right for them.
We'll talk about the evolution of testing. They're a lot more precise in what they're able to tell you these days, and that's where the issues come in, isn't it?
In some ways they're more precise because we have wonderfully powerful genetic techniques that can point out alterations, tiny alterations in genes that can alter their function. But on the other hand, they're a little bit less precise because for these common diseases, many different genes are involved and environmental factors are involved. So having a mutation in one gene that you can define precisely doesn't tell you if you're going to get diabetes or Alzheimer's or colon cancer. Just says your chances are higher than average. In that sense, it's not so precise because people don't get definitive information. They get hints about their risks being greater or average for diseases.
And that's one question we'll address later about the importance of these tests and what they mean and how some people may rely on them too much. But I want to talk about, again, looking at the book, the whole goal of it, the consumer orientation. You talk to consumers.
Yes. In fact, as part of my research for the book, I consulted with consumers. I did 100 interviews with people, just regular people who were considering genetic testing for one reason or another. And I learned about their thought processes, their decisions, what went well, what didn't go well. So in fact, a lot of the book and a lot of what I offer as advice comes from the real world experience of people struggling with decisions about genetic testing.
It seems to me that probably the one answer you got out of all that is that one size certainly does not fit all. Everybody's going to have a different answer.
Exactly, and it's right nowadays we're seeing all kinds of advertisements on TV and on the internet saying, have yourself tested, we'll tell you everything you want to know about your genes, and that worries me because people may want some kinds of genetic information and not others. People may not want any genetic information at all because it might not help them and in some ways might create problems for them. So it's important, and this is one of the main messages of the book, it's important for everyone to think through the issue of testing for themselves and decide if it's right for them.
And you know, besides consumers, you also talk to experts, so you got kind of the looking down perspective from the folks who know about how all this works too.
Yeah, I also consulted with genetic professionals, genetic counselors, researchers, and doctors. And what we've learned is that many physicians in practice, family practice, and in the specialties don't have much experience themselves with this form of genetic testing. And that puts an extra burden on the individual, the consumer, the patient, to work things out for themselves. It's not just following doctor's orders. You have to think this through.
I want to get into the four big questions you ask consumers to ask themselves in a moment. But I also want to talk about the testing kind of focuses on 4 different types of illnesses: breast and ovarian cancer, but they're different, but they're closely connected; colon cancer, late onset Alzheimer's, and hereditary hemochromatosis.
Yes.
What is that last one, first of all?
Oh, that's an iron storage disease in which, because of gene mutation, the bodies of individuals with those mutations has a tendency to not process iron properly, and they store more iron than they should. And the iron gets stored in tissues, in the heart, in the joints, and wherever it gets stored and accumulates, it interferes with function. And the trouble with hemochromatosis, which most people have never heard of and can scarcely pronounce, is that's really quite common, but it's so poorly recognized by the medical community that it's diagnosed as many different things until it's recognized for what it is. But it's really one of the more common genetic disorders.
Well, even though we haven't heard of that, it is common, and so are the others: breast and ovarian, colon, and late onset Alzheimer's. These are all ones that probably a majority of the population will have to deal with at some point or another,
right,
whether themselves or their family or friends.
And these are the diseases we fear. You know, we don't want to get them, and we try to avoid them in any way that we can. But I use these diseases, these 4 different disorders, as models. In fact, the kind of guidance that comes out of the book would apply to any kind of genetic test. But for the purposes of my research, I thought it best to concentrate in these 4 areas so I could get into depth and understand the issues that consumers are struggling with.
Well, let's help consumers understand, and as I said, you've got kind of 4 kind of focus questions for them to look at. I'm going to ask each one and then have you elaborate on what you're looking for there. First question: am I at higher risk for a disorder?
Okay, this is the first question consumers should consider. And the reason for that is that there are hundreds, soon thousands of genetic tests. Do you want to be tested for every possible thing? The answer, of course, is no. We want to focus on areas in which you might be at higher risk than other people. And so that first question requires people to look at their families and see, do we seem to have more cases of colon cancer than other people? Does it seem to come on earlier in life than it tends to for most other people? And that family history gives us a clue as to what we might be more susceptible to. Doesn't mean we are, because all of these diseases come with no genetic component. They just come because of environmental factors that promote the onset of the disease. But we have to, first say, is there a reason to have the test at all?
Okay. The next question, can genetic tests give me useful information? And first of all, if you're testing for something you're probably not going to have, the answer is probably going to be no. But can it give me useful information?
Okay, so suppose you think that there's a higher risk in your family of Alzheimer's disease. You have to then say, what will the genetic test tell me? Will it give me information that could be useful? And the answer to that is, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. For something like colon cancer or breast cancer, and even hemochromatosis, the most important thing to do would be to find someone in the family who already has the disease and ask them to be tested, because they would be the most likely people to have the mutant gene if that was a part of the cause of their disease. So if you don't have a relative you can go to, and you have a genetic test, say for colon cancer susceptibility, and you don't seem to have the mutant gene, that doesn't really let you off the hook, because we don't know all the mutant genes yet associated with colon cancer. It could be another gene that we don't know about yet, or it could be a mutation that hasn't been discovered yet. You're the first one. So, it's important to realize that just running in and having a test doesn't necessarily give you any information, because a negative result may not really be a negative result. And a positive result that you have the mutant gene doesn't mean you're going to get the disease, because other genes are involved, the environment is involved, And many people with mutant genes never develop these disorders. So you have to be careful. The genetic test can give you information. If there is a family mutation and you have it, you know your risk is higher. But unless you know what the family mutation is, you may not learn much from the test. So you have to be prepared for this.
Well, and there's levels. Is a 10% risk something to worry about as opposed to a 50 or 60% risk?
Exactly. Some of the mutations we know about now, the mutations in these susceptibility genes, raise risk considerably. So a woman's risk for breast cancer may be raised from 12% to 85% for some of the mutations. But other mutations may double the risk from 0.1% to 0.2%. That's significant. Will that give you information that is worthwhile having?
The next question I found really interesting because of the way people work these days, and is the timing right for testing? Why is that an issue?
Well, it's an issue in a number of ways. Genetic testing brings with it a number of pressures and tensions and problems. And some of those problems are, dealing with the genetic information itself. If you should be determined to have a mutation, people take that personally and suffer from it. Nowadays, we tend to think that genes are everything. They're not, but we tend to think that. And so people who are found to have a mutant gene find that they feel diminished, they feel tainted, or somehow, less morally worthy than they were before. So there's the personal psychological effect of finding out that you have a mutation. But there's also, the fact that genes are shared in families. So finding out that you have a mutant gene conveys a responsibility to tell others in the family. And those others in the family may be having stresses and problems as well. So what you have to do is try to find the moment, if you can, when life is particularly free of job problems or other health problems or financial problems, to do genetic testing. And there's another aspect of timing, and that is the stage of your life that you're in. So many people say, well, I'd like to have the children tested to see if they're also at risk for colon cancer or ovarian cancer. And that's a problem, because some people, when they're adults, want genetic information and some don't. So if you rush ahead and test your children, you may be giving them genetic information that they would not have wanted to have. The other thing is that if the genetic information doesn't provide any medical benefit, it doesn't seem worthwhile to test children. So the time of life is important too, and though many people would love to know if a particular mutant gene in their family has been passed on to their children, in general we say, let's wait. Unless there's a medical benefit, let's wait until they're old enough to decide for themselves whether to have that information.
Well, one thing I want to point out, you mentioned this to me in the previous interview, that people don't remember, is that we all are genetically imperfect.
Absolutely. The estimate of how many mutant genes we all carry varies, but let's assume we all have about a dozen mutant genes. Most of the time, they won't show up because other genes take over the workload, and we don't have any health problems. But we all have genetic imperfections, and the difference is that it's one thing to say we all have genetic imperfections compared to knowing what the imperfection is, and knowing that you have a particular mutant gene that raises your risk for breast cancer seems to cause great stress, as I said, psychological stress for people. It really shouldn't. And one time while I was interviewing a woman, said she was very guilty because she had given her son this mutant gene, and I said, but you got your genes by chance and you passed them along by chance. It's nobody did this, it's nobody's fault. Why are you feeling guilty? And she paused, and she really didn't have a reason. It's just that somehow it come through her to her son, this particular mutant gene. But we all have mutant genes, and we got them from our parents, and we'll pass them along to our children, and that's just the way it is.
And the other thing, and you kind of touched on this earlier, talking about environmental issues, we are more than our genes. That gene test is not going to determine the rest of our lives.
No, it really doesn't. Now, in some cases, and maybe we'll get to this with the last question, it can help us make changes that will lower our risk. But in fact, you know, we are all the products of genes and environment. And that environment is, you know, diet, diseases that we were exposed to, toxins in the atmosphere, and things that we don't even know, environmental factors that we haven't yet identified, that could become as early as from our life in the uterus to, you know, as late as yesterday passing a toxic waste dump. So we're all, thank goodness, a product of more than our genes. It's genes and environment that make us who we are.
Well, let's get into that last question then. Do the benefits of having the genetic information outweigh the problems that the testing can bring?
Okay, so that's the last question. And there you have to weigh what are the benefits and what are the problems. So some of the benefits could be that if you know you're at higher risk for colon cancer, for instance, what can you do about it? Well, for colon cancer, you can do something about it. You can put your reluctance aside and have colonoscopies. And colonoscopies can pick up, you know, polyps in early stages before, while they're benign, and they can be removed. And you avoid the eventual march to colon cancer itself. So if there is some medical benefit, something you can do to lower your risk, that's a plus. For some people, just having information is a plus. There are those among us, you know who you are, who are information seekers, and the more you know about yourself, the better, no matter what the information is. So there are good things that can come from having the genetic information, but there may be some problems as well. For instance, could that information harm you in some way? If others find out about it, employers, insurance companies, could it prevent you from getting insurance or raise your rates so that they're unaffordable? Now, this problem with insurance is pervasive. Nearly everyone I interviewed mentioned it. And there has been passed by Congress in last year the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, and that is intended to prevent genetic information from being used to deny people health insurance or to deny people jobs at hiring or promotion stages. And that's a good thing. But it doesn't cover life insurance, it doesn't cover disability insurance, it doesn't cover people in the military, it doesn't cover long-term care insurance. So there are still, even with this first step through GINA to protect people from being harmed by genetic information, there are still ways that genetic information can cause problems.
And some states have also taken their own actions too.
Yeah, and many states have some forms of protection of one's genetic privacy. The problem is that in this day and age, with the internet and information being hacked everywhere, people just don't believe that their genetic information really will be kept private. And so there is a worry that if the information becomes known in critical places in your life, could it deny you educational opportunities, health insurance, and so forth.
And there's a whole sort of sub-industry of testing off the grid, I call it, where you go under an assumed name to get a test or try to cover up the test so that it doesn't become public knowledge that you may have this. That's
because of some of the downsides, exactly, of genetic testing, people have gone to these lengths that you've mentioned. They've had genetic testing under an assumed name. They've gone on the internet and arranged for genetic testing without connection to the medical community. So they send their blood sample or their cheek sample, surface sample in, and the genetic test gets done and the results come back to them. So all this is done apart from the medical community. And what's worrisome about that is that people are then denied the opportunity to make a healthcare plan that can actually lower their risk and improve their health because they're managing it all themselves. So people have gone to great lengths to get genetic information without other people finding out, and I think that's very sad.
Well, psychologically, that's got to have an impact on the person.
Yeah, because you're sort of feeling that you have to hide your genetic information because what it says about you.
And of course, if you get tested, your family gets tested in one sense, because if there is something that is a genetic thing, it's a possibility in the rest of the family, and that's got to be an issue too.
It is an issue, and for many people this is a plus. Well, if a woman knows that she is a higher risk for breast cancer because she has the susceptibility gene, she has daughters, her daughters might benefit from knowing that there's a genetic component to the illness in their family, and they could be alerted to also have testing or to take steps to avoid breast cancer through having regular mammographies and so forth. So for many people, informing other members of the family is a real plus of the genetic test. And for others, that's a burden, because perhaps the family hasn't been on good terms. How do you call up a relative you haven't spoken to in years to tell them that they might be at higher risk? Or do you just not call them up? I mean, that is a struggle that many people have to face, and that's a downside of testing.
Another value issue about all this that I want to touch on is, while if you're susceptible to colon cancer, it's easy to get a colonoscopy, and it really is. It's not that big of a deal. But somebody who's diagnosed as having a high chance of developing breast cancer, sometimes it's a prophylactic approach by getting the breast removed ahead of time. And there's some pretty serious decisions that can get made sometimes.
Women concerned about breast and ovarian cancer do have to consider whether it makes sense, if they're found to have a susceptibility gene that raises their risk, to remove the organs, the ovaries and breasts, while they're still healthy, before any disease process has started, as a way of reducing their risk. And it's a very difficult decision for people to make, to remove a healthy organ so that there can be a lower risk. It never goes to zero, because even with the best surgeons, some tissues still remain, and but it does lower one's risk considerably. But it's a very difficult decision.
And that's obviously an extreme choice. But another thing I want to talk about is, for example, the example of being tested for Alzheimer's. There's no treatment in particular. I mean, once you develop, there's various drugs and stuff. But what good does it do me to know that I might develop Alzheimer's later in life?
Well, I asked that question of people who had that family history of Alzheimer's disease. And some people said, without having any means of intervention, this is useless information. Because I'll worry the first time I forget the keys, or where I parked the car in the parking lot, I'm going to assume that the disease has started. So that information will only make me worry. That'll be the black cloud over my head every day. But others said that information is useless, is useful to me. Why? Because then I can plan my life around it. I can retire early, I can take that trip sooner, and I can be available to try new drugs when they come on the market that might be protections against Alzheimer's. So, people are different, and that's why it's an individual decision.
It seems like every day you read about a new genetic test coming on the market, and I imagine that's just going to make things more difficult for people. Gee, I can get tested for this, should I?
Well, exactly. And of course, there are people who are having they're famous people and scientists like Craig Venter and James Watson, who have had their whole genome sequenced and mostly published it on the, in ways that make it publicly available. But these are people who are information seekers. They're leaders in the field. For the rest of us, it's going to be tougher. We'll have to make decisions about whether the test is worth it to us, and whether we can answer yes to all those 4 questions that form the decision template that I recommend in the book.
All the consumers you talk to, any stories that stick out? I mean, there had to be a wide variety of answers to the question of whether I need this test from the people you talk to out there.
There were. I guess I was really impressed that people took the time to be so open with me about this struggle about how hard it was in some cases to decide about testing, and the stresses and strains of dealing with the information. And perhaps the most poignant ones were the interviews with women who had opted for risk reduction surgery, removal of healthy breasts. They clearly had a great struggle to come to that decision. Most of them were happy having made the decision because it lowered their risk, but in many cases that surgery itself opened them up to problems because they had health problems associated with the surgery and the recovery from the surgery. But I think just listening to people look deeply into their lives and share their experience was very powerful for me, and I tried to test or not to test to be faithful to their thoughts and feelings and suggestions.
A number of years ago, you wrote a book, Does It Run in the Family? A Consumer's Guide to DNA, Testing for Genetic Disorders. That was actually more than 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Have the advancements been so great to merit the second book?
Well, I hope so. Well, actually, yes. The first book, Does It Run in the Family, came out at a time when most of the genetic testing available was for what we call rare disorders, things like Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, diseases that are not well known because they affect fewer than 200,000 people in our population. But actually, the sum total of all the people dealing with rare diseases is a fair number of people in our society. 10 years ago, most of the genetic testing was geared toward the rare diseases. And it's been in the last 10 years with new genetic techniques and ways of scanning the genome that we now have access to, that we have ways of looking at the genes that are associated with the common diseases. And it's this kind of genetic testing that's really being pushed now, and it's why I thought a new book was necessary at this point.
Well, I know it was an odd question, but the reason I asked it was my next question is, next 10 years, it's going to be entirely different. There's going to be a lot more tests and just more things you can get checked out, or is it going to be that much different?
Well, I don't know. We'll have to see. I do believe that we're entering what scientists call a new era of medicine called genetic medicine, and it may be that medical care will be far more genetically based than it has ever been in the past. It may be that we'll have the ability to find genes that tell us whether certain treatments will work for us or won't work for us. So we're talking or anticipating an era of personalized medicine in which you go to the doctor, you don't take any clothes off, you just hand the doctor your genetic code, and the doctor can help diagnose from it and can see from the particular genes that you have which medications or treatments would work for you and which won't. So they won't waste time with the ones that won't work, and they'll give you the ones that do work, and you'll have the best treatment for your disorder. So the new era of genetic medicine is coming. But even so, even when that happens, I still argue that people have to decide for themselves whether any particular genetic test is right for them.
Yeah, and if you're living a healthy lifestyle, that's going to be different than if you're living next to a chemical plant and things like that.
Right. I think it's certainly worthwhile to always try to live a healthy lifestyle. Sometimes a genetic test is the right push for people to actually do it.
The book is To Test or Not to Test by Rutgers University Press. Doris Zallen, Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Virginia Tech, founder of the Choices and Challenges series, a wonderful series of science and technology issues of great public interest here at Virginia Tech. I'm Paul Lancaster. Thanks for joining us.
Think Forward. Think Research Channel.